For this sermon, I got to thinking about something I've been doing with Josiah for the past couple of weeks, and it's reading the Chronicles of Narnia. How many of you have read the Chronicles of Narnia before? I wasn't sure how Joe would receive this. I mean, he's only 7 years old. But I started off with what used to be the first book, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And he loved it. He thought it was great. He couldn't wait for me to read another chapter. And I've limited it to only 1 or 2 chapters a night. Keep them looking forward to what's going to come the next night. I'm actually really glad that we've been reading this because there's a lot that I've actually forgotten from these stories. When I started writing my sermon, we were actually at the part of the book where all 4 of the kids have finally entered into this land called Narnia. And they've entered it through this almost magical wardrobe. It transported them into this cold, frozen world. And when they go there all together, they encounter this family of beavers. And this family of beavers actually, they invite them into their house and they begin to tell them all about what is going on in Narnia. In particular, they began to talk to them about someone called Aslan. For those of you who have read the stories, you know who Aslan is. Aslan is the lion of the story. And he shows up in every single Chronicle of Narnia. And he's the only one to do so. What's interesting about Aslan is that he is no ordinary lion. Simply by mentioning his name, the kids begin to get this strange feeling inside. And when they finally meet him, they even have a hard time looking straight at him, looking into his eyes. His presence brings a sense of awe and inspiration and hope. But it also completely changes everything around them. You remember how I told you how Narnia was this frozen, cold, and frozen land? Well, with the coming of Aslan, everything begins to thaw, the ice, the snow. Everything changes. Nothing is as people expected it to be. As I've been reading this story to Josiah, I've been pondering the impact that a person's presence can have in our lives. There are a lot of people that come into our lives. They come and they go. And as I was thinking about this, I happened to remember a time back when Wendy and I, back before we became parents, when Wendy and I used to take care of other people's kids. And one way that we used to do that was we actually had a parents' night out that we would hold in our church. And the parents would go off, they would have fun, they would go watch a movie, they would go out to dinner, they'd go do shopping that they've been meaning to do. One person actually went home, they started cleaning the house. They did all kinds of things. And we gave them the opportunity to do that. And we had a great time with the kids. And the parents would come back, and as soon as they came back, almost always they would ask us, so, how did they do? Point to the kid in our congregation. And we would always say they did great, because they would. We would have a great time. No trouble whatsoever. And the parents would kind of scratch their heads and be like, I don't know if I really believe you, because that's not the way they act around them. I didn't fully understand this until I became a parent myself. But I've learned it's not just kids that act differently around different people. We all act differently sometimes, depending on the company that we keep. And I found this out rather profoundly when I became a pastor. I've been in stores talking with people, and it never fails that if I talk long enough with them, eventually the question comes around. It's the question that we all ask of each other sometimes. So what is it that you do? Ann knew exactly what question I was going to ask. What is it that you do? Well, it's an innocent enough question. It's a question that we use to find out more about each other. But it's also it's also one of those questions that we begin to formulate how we're supposed to interact with another person. Oh, you're a politician. Oh, you're a lawyer. I got a question for you. Oh, you're a pastor. When I tell them that I'm a pastor, suddenly the way they talk and the way they act changes, sometimes dramatically. A lot of the time I hear less cuss words. And apologies if they use them. And sometimes the stories will get a lot cleaner. But every now and then I run into somebody who wants to throw me a zinger. And they tell me something just to try and shock me. They want to see how I'm going to react. They want to see how I'm going to treat them in return. Different people in our lives cause us to act, to speak in different ways. And it's not just preachers who have that kind of ability to change other people around them. It could be a parent walking in when we're kids. It could be your best friend walking in. It could be your kid walking in. It could be a long-lost buddy who knew you way back when, and all of a sudden everything changes. You either get more relaxed or you get more on edge. Maybe you start watching what topics you're going to bring up. Maybe you become more talkative, or maybe you clam up altogether. Just imagine how you feel when you're driving down the road and a police car pulls in behind you and begins to follow you for a while. Or imagine how you act when an ambulance with a siren blaring passes by. There are many people, many situations in which the way we act, the way we think, begins to change when we are in their presence. It causes me to wonder, what if it was Jesus? What if it was Jesus? What if all of a sudden it's God that shows up, or at least we finally see or realize that God is there? Think of how Moses changed when he heard the voice of God calling to him from a burning bush. Think of how Samuel was transformed when he was sleeping in the temple and all of a sudden he awoke to hear his name being called by God. Think of how Mary felt and how her entire life was transformed when she was told by the voice of God that she would have a child and name him Jesus, and that he would save the world. Imagine the change that came over Paul, who once was called Saul, when he fell off of his horse and he heard the voice from above saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" When he was on his way to Damascus to go and round up some of those rowdy Christians. Each of them experienced the presence of God in a very real and dramatic way, and it changed their lives forever from that day on. The difference between God and the presence of all the other people in our lives is that God is never actually gone. God doesn't disappear and then show up again later. It's merely our perception of God that changes. The writer of the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis, once wrote that we may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God. The world is crowded with him. He walks everywhere, incognito, unrecognized, yet still there. We become so preoccupied with the things that we must do and so overwhelmed by the pace of life that we often forget to look or even recognize God's presence around us or even at work within us. It's like the two passages that we heard read this morning. In the gospel lesson, we find that Christ is the Word of God and that has been with us since the beginning of creation, and yet the world is blind to him. And even when he shows up in the flesh, the world still does not recognize him, does not see him. In Psalm 139, one of my favorite psalms to read at a funeral, the psalmist speaks of the presence of God with us always, from before we were ever born to long after we are gone. God is there. God is present. God is always near. We just don't always realize it. But what would happen if we did become more aware of God's presence with us? What sort of transformation would come over us if we realized we were in the presence of God? As you know, each week during the season of Lent, I'll be talking about a different spiritual discipline that Christians have used throughout the ages to help them in their walk with God. And this week, I'd like to talk to you about a discipline that's called mindfulness. Have you heard of this one before? And mindfulness is where we seek to become more mindful of God's presence at work around us and within us. There's a lady, her name is Karen Maine. She actually wrote a book on this, all about mindfulness. And she called the book The God Hunt. And she said that mindfulness is like going on a God hunt. We're looking for God. It says it is a way that we keep our soul awake, she said. Paying attention to where God is at work around us and within us. Mindfulness, or being mindful of God's presence, is a way of living into a deeper awareness of God's activity in our lives. It begins by taking short pauses during the day to check in with God, to look for God. Through these short pauses, we begin to form a new way of perceiving our world, a new way of interacting with our world, by turning our hearts more and more toward God, and more towards this intention of living in relationship with God through Christ. It can start as simple as before answering the phone. Everybody has to listen to the phone ring every now and then. And right before you pick it up to answer it, you say, Lord, I am here. Help me listen. It could be as you wake up in the morning, starting the day by greeting God and inviting God's assistance to help you face what the day brings. Some of us have our honey-do list. Some of us have our to-do list. We all have places to go and things to do and sometimes people to see. It could be as you walk into the store, or right before you walk into a store, a post office, your house, or where you work, and just stopping before you go into those places and saying a quick prayer to God to help you be more mindful of God's presence. One of the ways that I have taken mindfulness into my own life is this way. My parents actually bought us a Wii for Christmas. Have you all ever heard of a Wii before? I see a lot of nods. A Wii is actually, it's a game that you hook up to your TV. And ours has fitness games like running and throwing and jumping and a bunch of sports that you can try and improve your time on, and it's supposed to get you in shape, and I'm hoping it will. Well, to play the game, you have to create what is called a me. Well, this me becomes you in the game. Some people try to make it look like themselves, and they create this me, and then that me is right there in front of you through every game that you play. That represents you. That's your avatar. Well, as a means of practicing this discipline called mindfulness, I created a me called Jesus. I played with Jesus Jesus several times on many different games so that every time someone finishes an activity and looks to see what their score is, there's Jesus. He's already on the board. And not only that, but the computer remembers the me's that you have created and places them along the road when you're running, or places them out in the crowd cheering you on as you're trying to walk this tightrope or as you're trying to do some other activity in the games. And there, each time, in every game, there's Jesus. In this simple way, it helps to remind me of God's presence with me as I work out. It also helps somebody who is very competitive to keep that in mind, that God is there. And I'll tell you, it has changed the kind of person that I am. Being mindful of the presence of Christ is simply a way that we show our love to Him and stay connected to Him throughout the day. It's also a means of allowing ourselves to see and to be changed by the realization that God is near. This week, to help you be more mindful of God's presence, we have the symbols of Christ's body before us and Christ's blood. The very presence of Christ, not just around us, but within us, to be taken with us wherever we go. It's set here right before us on the table. As we are nourished this morning in worship, let us continue to be nourished each and every day by taking time to be mindful of God's presence with us, so that we might hear, so that we might see, so that we might understand what God longs to reveal to each of us. In your bulletins this morning, you will see a handout, an insert. And on that insert, it will give you some ideas of how you might practice this spiritual discipline called mindfulness. There are also some reflection questions on the back that once you have tried this, you might ask yourself those questions and think more profoundly about this experience.